Hi there, I'm James Brown and welcome to episode 11 of the ADHD Adult UK Podcast. Sadly, according to most of our listeners, I'm joined by a man described as a partially grown-up version of Bod, the circular-headed cartoon character from the 80s, and my fellow co-founder of ADHD Adult UK, Alex Connor. Alex, hi.
Guten Tag, willkommen. Wie geht's dir?
Sprechen wir normalerweise auf Deutsch in diesem Podcast?
I'm just going to leave you two to carry on in German, and I didn't realise it was ADHD.
You didn't realise this is your podcast. I thought I would get a bit of warning about that.
No, you did well. You did well. I'm somewhat flummoxed, but anyway, Alex, how are you?
I'm well, thank you, James. Somewhat improbably, we're now in the top 7% of podcast downloads globally, despite your involvement, and we're still getting amazing comments from all over the world. Can I read one out?
Can I stop you there, because our 10 listeners are all now aware that you're going to say Robert from Kidderminster. So if you could just move on to the actual email and save them the bother.
Okay, I'll straight to the real one. Then we've had an email from Sylvia from the West Midlands region. And Sylvia's asked me to point out, it says, "Dear Alex, great show. Can you point out to James that he hasn't actually got imposter syndrome? He is bad at everything." It's a bit harsh.
It is, especially as Sylvia from the West Midlands area is probably my mum, isn't it, Alex?
It is your mum, yeah. Do you want a proper one? We've had a real one from someone that I won't say the name because they've got a son who has ADHD, a teenage son, and they wrote, having listened to a few of your podcasts, I now have a massively improved understanding and consequent empathy for his situation. So I just want to say a big thank you. Keep up the good work. I'll continue to tune in and learn. Despite not wanting to, James, we've helped a couple of people.
I know that's not wanting to. I know that it's against your very fibre to help people, Alex, but fingers crossed that at least some of our 10 listeners are getting something from these podcasts. So thank you for that. As always, our podcasts are a tragedy in 3 parts. We choose a theme. In the last episode, we covered impulse spending. And in this episode, we're talking about those people in our community of ADHD adults who don't have a diagnosis and maybe don't ever plan on getting them. A friend of Alex's, let's call him Tom, because that's his name, described this as, I probably don't have ADHD, but I have symptoms. As usual, the 3 parts of the podcast include some evidence-based psychoeducation, personal reflections on what this theme means to us, and then also some top tips. And just to annoy Alex, of course, we'll fit in the game of what has James lost, forgotten, or mislaid this week. Alex, do you want to introduce the subject? Just stop sighing for a second. Alex, do you want to introduce the subject and our guest, so-called Tom?
Yes, please. Right. Hello, all. We realised this idea of having some of the symptoms of ADHD, or even having ADHD, and not maybe being ready for a diagnostic process is a really big part of our community. Maybe you don't care or even need a diagnosis, or maybe it's just too early for you on your learning journey or whatever that is. Or maybe we voted for people that de-invest in mental health provision. Good God, they're a bunch of charlatans. And therefore it's really tricky to get a diagnosis. In fact, some stats for you, because you love them, James, because you like that. We've recently been told by an occupational therapist, and we've checked this out with some psychiatrists, that there are only 120,000 adults diagnosed with ADHD in the UK. So if that's anywhere near true, the undiagnosed outnumber the diagnosed by more than 15 to 1, which is fine for a Channel 4 game show, but not for managing a mental health condition. So that's well over 1 million adults who haven't got a diagnosis. So what we did, we asked Tom, who pointed this out to us, if he joined us on another one of our very special guest podcasts, and Tom's with us now. Hello, Tom.
Hello. Thanks for having me on. It's nice to be here.
No, thanks for coming on. How are you doing?
I'm not doing too badly. I'm not doing too badly at all. It's interesting to see the kind of level of professionalism that you promised has been delivered already, which I really like.
Yeah, we definitely said that.
You set my expectations exactly.
Yeah, appropriately low. From a psychoeducation perspective, there's loads of data out there on medication hesitancy, even with a diagnosis. But it's starting to get data now supporting this idea of diagnosis hesitancy. Now, this can be because we feel we might not need or benefit from a diagnosis and what that means. Some people feel very scared about any ramifications of having a perceived mental health disorder. Do I declare it, or do I have to tell the driving license people? And loads of people actually feel fraudulent, even thinking that there might be a reason for the struggles that they're going through. I've been in all three categories at one time. I actually felt it was very convenient having grounds for being lazy and childish and somebody telling me, oh, that's okay. So you've agreed to tell us some stuff about your situation, which seems unwise, Tom. Is that right?
That is right. It'd be an awful podcast if you got this wrong at this point. But yeah,
we've done worse.
I suppose. I mean, obviously, these kind of things. The journey is a whole life, of course. That sounds a lot more poignant than I intended it to, but it is. But I suppose really the kind of beginning to consider ADHD as a thing has been a thing in the last sort of 6 to 12 months. As Alex, you'll probably remember quite well, the first time that I ever considered this was in a pub in the Wolf in the Jewellery Quarter in Birmingham. Myself and Alex were having a drink, and you were talking about ADHD, and you sort of just turned to me and said, "Tom, it's completely inappropriate for me to diagnose you out of a clinical setting." However, took a sip of your point and began to do exactly that. And I think word for word, I told you to fuck off.
Yeah.
I think
that's a natural response from anybody that spends any time with
normally.
Alex.
Yeah, it's fair.
Not necessarily because I thought that it's a bad thing to have ADHD. I just had never associated it with myself and had no idea where you were getting that from. But I think over the last sort of 6 to 12 months, I have noticed things. You specifically have got really good at knowing I do things without knowing I do things. One thing that always stands out is you just be having a conversation and you'll sort of go, like how presumably you can't stand still while you brush your teeth. And I can't. I've never stood still while I brush my teeth. I've never managed to button my shirt up in one go. I always get distracted midway through. I think I've never buttoned my shirt up in one go. I always end up doing something else in the middle of it. And you got very good at predicting these things that you couldn't possibly know unless you have cameras in my house. And as far as I'm aware, this is the only time you've had a camera in my house.
He's likely to have cameras in parts of your house, Tom, knowing Alex's track record.
Only parts. Oh, that's fine.
Yeah, the quiet parts.
Fab. So tell us a little bit about yourself, Tom. Kind of anything you want, really, anything that feels relevant. What you do for a living, how you feel, kind of symptoms, if you like, affect what you do for a living.
Yeah, absolutely. So I currently work for a charity called Science UK. And I work as a program officer for them. So we organise a summer set of activities for young people. But unsurprisingly, I have bounced through a lot of jobs and probably about 3 careers and I only turned 27 recently. So I've had quite a varied amount of places. I graduated from Birmingham. I moved to Sheffield for a little while. I was in Reading and working for the university there. And then I moved back to Birmingham, but continued to work for Reading. And then I moved to Germany and I taught in a few different places in Germany. And then I was in Ireland, and then I was in a different part of Ireland. And then I was in Edinburgh, and then I'm back to Birmingham. And now, actually, I think next week, this will be the longest time I've ever had a job. So in terms of career...
how long is that?
1 year and a week.
It screams neurotypical to me, Alex. I don't know about you.
Absolutely.
And in fact, this was the first job, the one I have now, where I've ever quit a job and had another one lined up. That's never happened to me before. So I suppose that would probably be an impact. Again, as you mentioned earlier, I always say I don't think I have ADHD, but I feel I have most of the symptoms, and all the things that help people with the symptoms tend to work for me. So there is that little bit of imposter syndrome. There is that little bit of unwillingness to maybe admit it. But yeah, so that's me and my career and what I do. I never know how to answer these kind of questions. Like, who are you? Do you want to see my Hinge profile?
I think you did a really good. You did a really good job there. And 27 as well, so young. You could be Alex's grandchild.
I don't know why you'd say something so hurtful to me.
No, of course, nobody
right,
wants to be related to Alex.
They don't. In fact, no, they're not going there. So what about day-to-day, Tom? What's your day-to-day life like?
So at the moment, I work from home, and I kind of live on my own. So that's the first time that I have ever done that. I've been doing that again for approximately a year now. That has been a challenge in a number of ways, but it has allowed for maybe a level of self-reflection that I have never had before in my life, which has again helped in this kind of general journey. But yeah, I work fairly regular hours. I keep myself busy with I love climbing. I do that a lot in the evenings. I probably ping between those two things. And of course, language learning. I find other languages really, really fascinating. This is how, obviously, for anyone that doesn't know, is how Alex and I met. We were on the same German course. So yeah, and I think one of the things that I find particularly fascinating about existing in other languages is that a lot of the things that I now recognize or believe as symptoms, I actually tend to lose in German. I tend to be a lot more focused in German. I lose track of thoughts a lot less. And I wonder whether part of that is because English, you can make up a sentence as you go along and never know how it's going to finish. But you just can't do that in German because the verb goes at the end. And I've always wondered whether that's been a thing that's meant that I was so attracted to that language specifically.
There is some psychological research showing when you speak in a different language, you have a different measurable personality change. I haven't looked at if that's still the case, but it was the case a few years ago. I've always been interested in that.
So does that mean
I'm definitely, because I'm as much of a mess in Spanish.
I was about to say, does that mean, Alex, you're just as psychopathic in German?
Equally, yeah. We prefer the term borderline sociopath.
Alex's sense of humor gets worse in German, if you're interested.
Oh, I can't. I barely tolerate his sense of humor as it is. So I can't imagine what it's like having to sit through a German class or have a conversation with Alex in German.
Intolerable.
Intolerable. So, Tom, what interests me is, after you've described your career and the fact that clearly you do have some of the symptoms of ADHD, is why you think you maybe don't fit into the kind of full fat ADHD model.
I like the full. I'm a blue top ADHD. It's a really good question. I think part of that is, so again, I've sort of got two weird sides of me going on here. Whereas there's the side of me that is kind of like, yeah, I'm reluctant to say that I have it. I don't necessarily like to say that I have it. I'm not sure whether I feel confident to say that I have it. But equally, I'm standing here on ADHD podcast, talking about ADHD and how that's affecting me. So there's kind of two different things going on there. And I've completely forgotten the question, which is probably quite...
You did kind of hard. You did answer it more fully than Alex answers most questions he get asked, but it was really about why you don't feel that you kind of maybe fit the mold of somebody with an ADHD label, if you like.
Yeah. So I suppose, yeah, where I was going with that is that there is, I think, a process that maybe I will grow to accept that more and more and more as I begin to recognize more of the things, particularly not just that happened to me now, but have happened to me in the past. And I go, oh yeah, do you know what that would be?
So that, Tom, fits. So Tom, early on you said there's a sort of unwillingness to accept or diagnose. Is that part of the same thing? Where does that unwillingness come from, do you think?
One of the things that stands out for me, I've got some friends that have ADHD. I've got some friends that actually similar sort of situation to me, and that they're actually getting There were those group of people that were actually very well behaved at school, so it was never picked up on, and they're only just getting to it now. And I don't know if they're going to listen to this, but I love them to pieces, but they're absolute messes. Or it really affects their more politically correct parts. It really affects their day-to-day life on an incredibly deep level. Whereas I think if I have got it, it's a lot more manageable for me. And there's part of me that just doesn't want to put myself in that camp because that feels so. It's not that I don't want to be in that camp; it's that feels so disingenuous. Because generally I'm fine. I have some effects. It's interesting as well because they really don't feel like that at all. They think it's hilarious. In fact, it's great to hang out with them because it just doesn't matter who's talking over who. We just don't care.
Yeah. I think
follow the tangent wherever it goes.
Generally, I'm fine is something we hear quite a lot. until you're not. I guess that's the thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So-
That's the case.
So what do you think the
pick up-
next step? Go on, James. Sorry.
No, it's fine. You carry on, mate.
So what's the next step on this journey then? If it is a process you're going through, do you know what's next for you, or how it feels to?
I haven't really planned ahead, if I'm honest with you. Lily, and see that I can see your triumphant grin at this. Yeah, no, I haven't planned ahead. I wanted to have a think about it before this podcast actually, but then sort of time got away from me. And yeah, so what is next? I think for me, actually, dealing with some of the symptoms. I'm quite comfortable calling them symptoms now, and addressing them as that. Dealing with some of them is something that I'm starting to work on and sort of build through that, and beginning to forgive myself or understand myself a little bit better. I've got a lot better at going of not putting myself, trying to put a round peg in a square hole, so to speak. Like I've started going, I just actually, you know what? I just wasn't listening to anything you've said in the last 30 seconds because I was thinking about ducks, because you ducked for a fly. And then I thought, it's weird that duck is a verb and a noun and those two things aren't related. And then I was thinking about ducks.
Sorry, Tom. James.
Yeah.
Sorry, Tom. James. Verbs and nouns are type of grammatical terms that the English
I know.
use.
You may joke, Alex. You may, because no one can ever tell. You have to put your hand up when you tell a joke so people can actually tell. But my understanding of grammar is so bad that Alex, who everybody remember is my ADHD coach, regularly, or should I say frequently, Alex, because I don't know, will
we don't do it once a month.
Will pick me up on it and chastise me for it gently at times. But yeah, my knowledge of grammar is just fucking atrocious. Vernacular's quite good though. I can do that.
You definitely can.
Well, that's the main thing.
It will not when you're the senior editor of a magazine, Tom, like James is.
I see.
So I like the discrepancy between generally I'm fine and I'm learning to deal with the symptoms, and I think this is what those friends of yours would say as well about everybody, all of us being what was it, the psychiatrist's term we use, a big hot mess. Mm-hmm. So bearing that in mind, the one advantage of thinking of it as a diagnosis is that you don't have to deal with it on your own, which leads to the question, Tom, what do you think would make your life easier in terms of your ADHD symptoms?
I mean, I suppose a better understanding from myself of them, and that's going more and more. I kind of the social acceptability of some of the traits would be a lot nicer. I grew to realize one of the things that I've grown to realize is masking and what that is. And masking is a concept that I'm really familiar with because I work with English as an additional language students who mask their English ability all the time. And some of them are so incredible at it, but there's actually no core to it. And I realized that actually I've been doing a lot of that in my life. And actually, yes, people zone out in conversations all the time, but nowhere near as much as me, and for nowhere near as long. And they're not as good at pretending that they have and picking back conversations and sort of diving in and trying to make an intelligent comment on something that I've only half listened to. So kind of the social acceptability of the good example of putting your hand up and going, oh, I just wasn't listening to that. I'm really sorry. I'm so interested. And that's not just professionally, like dates for me, like when dates that I'm really enjoying and going well, I'm just being like, oh, why am I not listening to this? Like, I really want to, but I've just zoned out. Like, there's nothing else. So I think to answer your original question, learn to manage the symptoms and understand them a little bit, but the social acceptability, it'd be nice if that changed a little bit. It's
an amazing point. And to say I'm so sorry for it is really interesting, isn't it? Should we have to do that? Do people with other disabilities have to apologise for the literal behaviours that they have to do? Probably not, James.
No, that they don't. But this is the issue, isn't it? There is documented stigma in society around ADHD, and if you add to that the almost absolute lack of acknowledgement or understanding that it exists in adults, to the point where even some psychiatrists say it's not real, and where lots of popular commentators say on social media it's not real because there isn't a biological marker which distinguishes it example. It's difficult to kind of imagine a future where it's so accepted that you would be able to just say at the start of a date or a conversation, oh, I've got ADHD, so if I do zone out a bit, it's not that I'm not interested, it's just my brain. Or that when you start a new job and you told your employer you've got ADHD, they automatically put support in place to make sure that you have everything that you need. We're a long way from that, but this is the reason we do what we do, I suppose, is to try and help educate everybody, not just people with ADHD, but their families, their employers, their healthcare professionals, that it's a real thing that needs support, and that so many people out there require help.
Yeah, admitting to professionals and admitting within work that that it's something that I deal with or I struggle with, that's very new to me, and that's something I still feel a little bit uncomfortable with. Out of interest, the first person that I ever did that professionally with was yourself, James. We actually discussed it in an email chain that we had.
Of course.
Whereas, I knew I was emailing somebody at someone at Aston, someone in your department, and I was aware that also Alex had this friend that did all of this, and we started talking about ADHD, and it just never clicked that you were the same person. Yes, that was ironically the first time that I did that.
So did you do that after I disclosed? Obviously, I've forgotten working memory. Had I disclosed to you that I'd got ADHD, and then you said something back, and then if so, was that because it felt like a safe environment?
That was exactly what it was. Go on.
Yeah, well, this is the key. Really, is I think so many environments don't feel safe if you are either undiagnosed or diagnosed, even to make that disclosure. I've been through the process of getting diagnosed, and I've been through assessments at work to support me. I've managed to gain, and this is a huge change for me, the ability to happily say to somebody, sorry, I wasn't listening, ADHD. In important meetings, in fact, when somebody suddenly says, James, what are your thoughts? And I've been miles away, I'll just say, yeah, you're going to have to send that to me because I wasn't paying attention. And it's actually an incredibly empowering thing to get to a point where you feel safe enough to do that. But I acknowledge that that's not a lot of adults with ADHD. It takes a lot of acceptance, and not just from you, but from your employer, often the people in the environment you're in, to get to that point. But once you do get to that point, and remember, we've talked about it being a reason, not an excuse, but it is really empowering to be able to say, I'm just so sorry I wasn't paying attention. And it's not your fault, and to not just chastise yourself for that.
Right. Before we take a break, I first of all, I have to say your comparison, Tom, is so good with masking of your learners learning English. I realised I mask as a human, as a real grown-up, but there's no core to it.
Just pretending.
Yeah, not one at all. So is there anything before we go to bed, anything you want to add or promote that we haven't discussed?
I think that was pretty much everything that I want to say onto those topics, or everything that I did want to say I've forgotten. I've been writing some stuff. I watch you write things down actually more and more when we have conversations. So this is what I've been doing here to keep track, which has been really helpful. But I think that was everything I've got for the minute.
You've pretty much hit every beat of what the research says, is to reduce the stigma, to advocate for adult ADHD support, and then self-education, even in lieu of medication. CBT can be a genuine benefit to ADHD people. So we're going to take a break. That was the first section of episode 11 of the ADHD Adult UK podcast. We're back in a second with part 2. Some more personal reflections really, on whether you should get a diagnosis or not, or where you are in that journey.
Welcome back to part 2 of episode 11 of the ADHD Adult UK podcast. In part 2, we give some personal reflections on the theme. Alex, have you got anything to share that's interesting and not completely mind-numbingly boring as usual?
Don't think so, James. No, I'll just go with the typical mind-numbingly boring. I resonate with almost everything Tom said, because I was there, and sometimes I'm still there, of being diagnosis hesitant. I think I was always much more medication hesitant than diagnosis hesitant, because it's just somebody telling me that this might be true. It still doesn't make it true, and people often say, well, the diagnosis made me feel safer, made me feel less like an imposter. But that imposter syndrome is still there, even with a formal diagnosis medication. It doesn't go away. I think that's part of the problem. But my main concerns about diagnosis were, firstly, the humiliation of not being believed by the medical team was a real, like, not passing that exam or something. That's how it felt. And actually, just practically, with executive dysfunction, the admin involved to going through the referral and turning up at the right time was pretty tricky. You know, I couldn't be bothered to fill it in, and I know loads of people feel like that. And then really, it's the old imposter syndrome that I am, in fact, just a lazy waste of space and not a real boy. That's how I feel, probably always will. When we did the podcast and Mickey O'Brien was on, she described a feeling similar to that we've heard described by the LGBTQ community, of sort of being something else to that portrayed. And I felt that very keenly. I was terrified that I was, you know, just a lazy freak, essentially. James, are you going to allow me to say that?
I had something lined up, and then I thought, you know what, all I've said so far has been bitter, twisted digs at you, so I'm going to let it pass. Alex, you are a freak. We all know that, but you know, you're our freak, aren't you?
Exactly. Yes, part of the team.
Yes. So,
what about you, James?
Yeah. So for me, there are definitely some similarities, but it's odd when I think back. So anyone that's listened, any of our 10 listeners that have listened earlier on in the podcast will remember that Alex told me 7 years ago, I think it was, when he was diagnosed, that I probably had ADHD symptoms as well. And at the time, I barely even considered it. I didn't know it was a thing, which I was a bit ashamed of as a scientist. Had to do some reading, did all the self-tests, and it was apparent that I did have the symptoms. But the first thing I thought was, I'm all right. I'm coping. And Alex and I have talked about this, and under the current diagnostic criteria, there is a chance I might not have been diagnosed because, it may not have been having a moderate impact on 2 domains of my life. I'd just been promoted at work, happy relationship at home, everything seemed fine, but I definitely had the symptoms. And I just then forgot about it. Alex and I didn't talk much about his ADHD for a while. And then the next thing that happened is a colleague of mine called Eric Hill, who's a really talented and clever stem cell biologist, started to struggle. And it was obvious to me that he had ADHD symptoms. So we sat down and had a chat, and that made me think about my ADHD then. And after Eric had gone on to get a diagnosis and it had really changed his working life, I did start to question whether it was something I needed to do, but I still didn't really push for it. And in the end, it took the pandemic and lockdown and a full-on mental health crisis and lots of trigger warning ideation about suicide, etc., for me to get in touch with Alex. And he said, at this point, you've got to get a diagnosis. You almost certainly have ADHD, and I think this will help. So it was really it was that pinch point that caused me to realize I needed a diagnosis. There was a little bit of medication hesitancy. I remember when Alex first told me about ADHD, that and this is massively ironic, that one of my first thoughts was, I don't want to take tablets because they might change me, which, considering the fact that I loathe myself with the fire of 1,000 suns, is an incredibly ridiculous statement to make. But I did think it would somehow change me into a different person when I hated even more. But that when I was soon forgotten, when I kind of forgot that I might have ADHD. So really for me, it took a mental health crisis to push me in that direction. Tom, have you got anything to add to what you've shared with us in part 1 in terms of personal reflections?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose my first thing really is actually a question, which is to Alex, which is, do you diagnose everybody you know? Like, is that your vibe?
It's just everybody he knows has ADHD. That's the problem.
People ask me.
Well, a lot of the things that Alex has pointed out to me are symptoms I just recognize as a thing that most of my friends have, because apparently we congregate. That's what we do, because it creates a nice accepting atmosphere where everyone's quite similar and has the same ways of thinking and the same processes. And you don't notice that actually the other, I'm not sure, percentage of the world doesn't necessarily think always like this. So I suppose that would actually make sense. But yeah, this seems to be a thing you do, Alex.
It's twice pretty much. I'm pretty sure there isn't a third person I could find that would say that. I mean, remember, I'm not a clinician, so I'm not professionally qualified to diagnose anybody, but because I'm not a clinician, there's nothing I can be struck off from. Except I'm the chair of the ADHD Adult UK charity, so I try never to do that anymore unless it's part of a kind of comedy conversation. James,
you also don't know 3 people, so it would be difficult to find that third person, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it would be the dog, wouldn't it?
Someone else diagnosed
him. Yeah, that's true. But no, I really don't. In fact, I think it's inappropriate to do it. And then with you, Tom, while I was drunk.
You did acknowledge that it was
Your Honour,
completely inappropriate outside of a clinical setting. So, that's at least you know. But
yeah, James, it wasn't me diagnosing it. It was rather me saying, you should go and speak to a doctor. That was more.
Oh no,
more
yeah,
the thing.
no. Well, the exact words you said to me was, "I've just been diagnosed with ADHD, and you're more ADHD than I am." And we laughed and laughed. And we now know this is obviously hugely inappropriate. But we were mere children, Alex, 40 years old, roughly at the time.
Yeah,
and therefore it was just as unacceptable then as it is now. Just before we go to break, Alex, I'm going to wait for the big sigh. We've got time for one more episode of a game of What's James Lost, Mislaid, Forgotten, or Misplaced this week. Alex's score is...
I was hoping I could fill, so we didn't have time for this.
No, not going to happen. I can do it quickly, mate, said the actress to the vicar. So Alex's score, I think it's 3 you've got, isn't it, so far out of about 8? Yeah.
7.
Okay, so your options this week are, did I forget where my car was? Did I forget to have a poo? Or did I forget to click send on an email that was really important, only noticing 3 days later?
I've done 2 of the 3 of those, and that's only because I don't have a car.
What, today or in general?
Not just today. I've lost my bike. I just leave my bike on campus quite a lot. Just walk home.
I once went home and then realised I'd cycled in, and I got home on the train. Okay, let me think about this, because my working memory means I always forget them. Click send on an email that's not important. I think you do that every week. Forgot your car. Oh, forgot to have a poo. Forgot to have a poo is too dangerous. I think you'd be very ill indeed. I'm going to say forgot your car. Tom, you can guess as well. If you remember
the thing is with the email is that I feel that maybe is not noteworthy enough to end up on a podcast. Like that's surely quite.
Depends how important it is, doesn't it?
Well, okay. If it was a very important email, then I'm going to go for the very important email.
Okay, so if those are your final answers, then Tom wins because he was right. I forgot to click send on an incredibly important email, and then only 3 days later, luckily, I Outlook has a thing now where it pops up saying, "Do you want to reply?" And I thought, no, but I did, and then looked, and it was in drafts, and it hadn't gone out, and I just about avoided getting into trouble. But the other 2 things have happened at other times in my life. So well done, Alex, for scoring 0.
I fucking hate this game.
I know, and that's why I love it so much. Why I love it so much. We'll be back in part 3 to talk about some top tips and for a product of the week recommendation. See you then.
Hello, welcome back to part 3 of episode 11 of our ADHD Adult UK podcast, where we've got Tom with us and we are discussing what's it like if you might not be thinking about getting a diagnosis. We haven't got a better word for this, have we? I've got ADHD symptoms, but have I got ADHD? Maybe we should call it that. So part 3, as always, is our top tips that either we've got or learned over the years, or that we've been given by other people for dealing with this issue, or rather it's a circumstance in this case this week, isn't it? So I'll kick off. For me, it's quite an easy one. That my top tip is talk to people. Talk to people about your ADHD symptoms. You're not a fraud. You're not an imposter. You're not just lazy. Talking to people could include us. Contact us in any of the socials on @ADHDadultUK and start to write your own script for what happens now, whether you seek diagnosis or not, whether you take that first step towards referral or whether you don't. You're still entitled to be a fully fledged, full fat blue top member of our ADHD adult community. You don't have to do anything, and you certainly don't have to do anything at anyone else's pace. The second tip is to have a look at the symptoms. We've got the ASRS, there are scores on our website, there are documents on our website where you can answer questions. It'll start to give you a hint of whether you're ticking those boxes for ADHD. And that gives you a little bit of evidence, a little bit of power that it's not just you making it up. And it can even help you, spur you to start that referral process if you want to, which would be a third top tip, which would be start the referral process anyway if it's bothering you. The waiting list can be huge in parts of the country, not always, but always months, I would say. If you don't actually lose anything getting on that thing, you can come off the waiting list. You don't have to. But you can access us at ADHD Adult UK without diagnosis, without planning to get one, or at any stage whatsoever for any ADHD symptom, or just have a chat, or even share your tips or coping strategies or how you feel about masking. Anything about ADHD symptoms and support, we don't care what the motivation here is. Oh, that was a bit high horsey, James. I'm surprised you didn't snore while I was talking. Give us a top tip, will you, James?
I didn't snore because, as usual, Alex, I wasn't listening. So my top tip is whether or not you decide to pursue a diagnosis or not is often circumstantial. So try and think, am I coping with my symptoms or are they ruling my life? You know, is the way in which my symptoms present something that I can notice, but I'm still productive at work, happy at home, I'm just dealing with the symptoms? Or if it's the latter and actually the symptoms are ruling your life, then start to have that almost internal conversation about, is this something I can benefit from? Particularly if, because there is support available for you at work, if you feel that you are struggling at work because of your ADHD symptoms, then I would, again, as Alex has suggested, I really fucking hate agreeing with anything Alex says, but do an ASRS test, take that to your GP with some evidence that you've had the symptoms since a child, if that's the case, and evidence of the impact it's having on your life, and get that referral done, because during the time between referral and diagnosis, you've got time to change your mind, to learn about your ADHD, or maybe things will change. But particularly if you are struggling at work and you feel that help at work, whether it's through an occupational health assessment or the Department for Work and Pensions Access to Work program, would benefit you, then I think you should go with that. And as Alex said, Jesus, I'm agreeing with him twice. This has never happened. I'm going to vomit into my own ears in a minute. Also,
it's very supportive today. I like it.
Yes.
Yeah, you should vomit into his, though. That would be a lot more effective.
That would mean being in the same room as him, Tom, which there's a whole other issue there of wanting to punch his perfectly circular face. The other thing is obviously read all the information that's out there. Learn about those symptoms. Learn what coping mechanisms might help you. And again, that might inform your decision. What about you, Tom? Have you got any tips?
Absolutely, yeah. So I suppose I kind of echo a lot of the things that you've already said, but something that I realized was there is literally no sunk costs in finding out more. Like if you go to find out more and what you find is a list of symptoms that don't match you and what you do, and you don't recognize any of them, then you have lost no more time than you'd lose dicking around on social media for half an hour here and there. Like it's a good thing to do. I'd also say as well, if you're suspicious that it could be a thing, or you want to know more, it really isn't ever too early to find out. I think much like yourself, James, like I did not come to that sort of stage in my life where I was looking at these things in a good way. Like, again, my mental health went completely off the rails in the pandemic, and I hit rock bottom in a number of ways. And that was the thing that put me in a kind of reflective mood, as it was. Like, that's a time to assess your life. That's a really, really effective way of doing it, but it's not a healthy way. It's not a good way. Like it's never too early just to think about it. And with there being no sunk costs, like why not just give it a Google? Like, why not just find out a little bit more?
And there's that thing that we've all kind of said that, oh, well, right now I'm fine, or generally I'm fine, or that there are other people, my friends, who are a hot mess and maybe they're worse than me. I have this mantra with people that not wanting to access support for yourself because other people out there might be struggling more than you feels a little bit like saying that you're not allowed to be happy in case other people out there are happier than you. which that way around is ridiculous. But when we're struggling, we always think, well, there must be people worse off than me. It doesn't work like that. Listen, thank you, Tom, for joining us for this. It was very illuminating, really helpful to have somebody at exactly that stage on our journey. We've just got time for product of the week, and I genuinely can't remember if I've already done this one in a previous podcast, because obviously I can't. But I'm overly excited about the timer switches on my lamps at the moment. I'm sure I've done this already before, but it's so amazing to take that one of those working memory pressures off my own shoulders, that I don't have to turn my lamps off before I go to bed. James looks so bored with this product of the week. We've definitely done it before, but that's go and get some timer switches.
Yeah, no, we haven't done it before. It's just it's just you speaking. It puts me into a stupor, Alex. You know this.
I do know. Right then, so that was episode 11 of our ADHD Adult UK podcast, talking about pre-referral perspectives, with wonderful help from a friend of the show, Tom, and from James and me as well. If you need anything at all, please contact us in the normal social media sites at ADHD Adult UK. If you've got any feedback or any ideas for new shows, we're always willing to listen to them. But for now, thank you. Goodbye.
See you soon.
Thank you for having me.